Red Mesa, Arizona Territory. Summer, 1883. The iron manacles bit into his wrists. Blood ran down his jaw. Two of Croft's men had him by the shoulders, dragging him off her land, but Rowan Hayes wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her. Willa stood in the middle of the yard, Winchester in her hand, eyes locked on his. Not crying, not begging, just watching the way a person looks at something they're trying to memorize before it's gone. Croft sat high on his horse, voice flat and certain. 5 days, Mrs. Lawson. Sign the deed or lose everything. She didn't answer him. She spoke only to Rowan, quiet enough that only he could hear it before they pulled him away. I'm not signing. His mouth bleeding, swollen, pulled into the smallest smile. He knew. He knew before they'd even finished the sentence. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with me, because this one doesn't let you stop in the middle. The windmill hadn't turned in 3 days. Willa Lawson stood on the porch and watched it. The blades were stuck at an angle, rusted solid, pointing toward a sky that offered nothing. No clouds, no mercy. Just that flat white heat pressing down over the mesa like a lid on a pot. 105 degrees. She'd checked the thermometer, nailed to the post that morning. The mercury had climbed so high, she half expected it to crack the glass. July in the territory had always been brutal. But this summer was something else. The creek had gone to mud 6 weeks ago. The grass was the color of straw. 2 of her neighbors had already sold out and gone back east, taking their broken dreams with them. She didn't blame them. She blamed Thayer Croft. She heard them before she saw them. That particular grind of wagon wheels coming up the road heavy, unhurried. The sound of men who believed they didn't need to rush because nobody was going to stop them. Willa stepped off the porch and walked to the edge of the yard. She pulled the Winchester from the crook of her arm and held it at her side. 3 riders, 1 wagon. Croft's brand on the horses, a big C burned into the hindquarter, clean and deep. The man in front rode a gray stallion that had no business being out in this heat. He had a thick black mustache and a wool vest in spite of everything. He looked at Willa the way men look at a locked door they're about to kick in. Mrs. Lawson. He didn't tip his hat. Mr. Croft sends his regards. Mr. Croft can keep his regards. She stood still, and you can keep yourself on the far side of my fence line. The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. He nodded to the 2 riders behind him, and they split off without a word. They went for the south corner of her barbed wire fence, the long section she'd spent 4 days stringing herself, post by post in 100-degree heat. One of them pulled out wire cutters. Don't, Willa said. Her voice was flat and clear, as a bell struck in cold air. They cut it anyway. She raised the rifle. Next cut, and I'll put that wire cutter through your hand instead of that fence post. The rider stopped. He looked back at the man on the gray stallion. The man on the gray stallion looked at Willa. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her eyes behind the rifle. Whatever he saw there made him hold up one hand. Easy, he said to the riders. To Willa, he said. Mr. Croft will have that well one way or another, ma'am. Might as well make this clean. My well is not Mr. Croft's well. She didn't lower the rifle. My husband filed that water claim. I inherited every inch of it, legal and recorded, filed in this county and 2 above it. That water belongs to this land. This land belongs to me, and you are standing on it. A pause. Just the dry creak of something metallic in the windmill behind her, trying to move and failing. 5 days, the man said. Mr. Croft gives you 5 days to think on it. She said nothing. He tipped his hat, then, only now that he was leaving, and pulled his horse around. The wagon turned with him. The riders fell in behind. She watched them until the dust swallowed them whole. Then she stood there a little longer, listening to nothing, the rifle still warm in her hand. She went back to the porch and sat down on the step and let herself breathe, just breathe. Her husband Eli had been gone 14 months. He'd built this homestead from blowing dirt and a dream, and she had buried him in the corner of the east pasture under a cedar tree he'd planted the first spring they arrived. She wasn't leaving him behind. She wasn't leaving anything behind. She set the rifle across her knees and looked out at the mesa. The sun was going down, not cooling, just sinking. The red rock faces of the mesa lit up orange and deep amber, beautiful in a way that still caught her off guard after 3 years of living beneath them. That was when she saw the horse. It came up the road at a walk, head dropped so low its nose almost dragged, dark with sweat, moving on nothing but stubbornness. And on its back, barely upright, barely there a man. He was leaning forward over the saddle horn, with both arms hanging loose, the way a sack of flour leans when you haven't tied it right. Willa stood. She watched him. Her first instinct was every sensible thing a stranger, a strange horse, a strange hour. Her second instinct was older and quieter, and it pulled harder. The horse made it to the edge of her yard and stopped. Done. Just done. The man slid sideways off the saddle and hit the ground in a cloud of red dust. She was down the steps before she thought about it, running across the packed earth, the Winchester still in her hand. She reached him and dropped to one knee beside him. He was face down. She grabbed his shoulder and rolled him. He was heavier than he looked, all hard muscle and trail-worn leather, a week of dust and blood ground into his clothes. He had a face that had seen weather and trouble in equal measure. Dark stubble, a cut above his eyebrow, and along his left side, soaking through his shirt and into his jacket, a dark stain that was still spreading. Gunshot graze. She'd seen enough of them to know. This one had cut along the ribs, not deep enough to be fatal on its own, but deep enough to kill slowly. Out here, in this heat, without water and rest, and someone to keep the wound from turning. His eyes opened. Brown, glassy with pain and exhaustion. He looked up at her the way a man looks when he can't quite believe what he's seeing. "You're on my land," Willa said. He blinked. "I'm aware." His voice was rough, scraped raw. "I'm sorry for it. Can you stand? I'll try." He couldn't. She got her arm under his good side and took as much of his weight as she could manage. It was a lot. He pushed himself up with sheer will. They crossed the yard together in a slow, stumbling line. She wasn't rescuing him exactly. She was just refusing to let him die in the dirt, because that wasn't something she was built to do. She got him up the porch steps. Through the door, she steered him to the narrow cot in the back room, the room where she kept tools and stock medicine and the extra lamp, and got him horizontal. He lay there, breathing through his teeth. Willa lit the lamp. She pulled back his jacket. The graze was ugly, long and ragged, and it had bled more than it should have because he'd been on a horse, for God knows how long without pressure on it. She went to the kitchen for water, for the clean cloth she kept folded in the second drawer, for the tin of sulfur powder, and the needle and thread she prayed she wouldn't need. She needed the needle and thread. When she came back, he was still awake. Barely. His eyes tracked her. "What's your name?" she asked. She kept her voice even, steady. A pause, like he was deciding what to give her. "Rowan," he said. "Rowan Hayes." She pulled a chair to the edge of the cot and sat down. She poured water into the bowl and pressed the cloth to his side and felt him go rigid against the pain. "All right, Rowan Hayes." She didn't look up. Her hands kept moving, careful and sure. "You're going to hold still, and you're going to tell me if you're about to lose consciousness, and you are not going to die in my supply room. I've got enough problems this week." He let out something that might have been a sound of agreement, or might have been a laugh that hurt too much to finish. Outside, the last light left the mesa. The stars came out hard and bright, the way they only do in drought years, when there's nothing in the air to soften them. The windmill groaned once in a gust that went nowhere. Willa Lawson cleaned a stranger's wound by lamplight, on the worst summer the territory had seen in a decade, with 5 days until a cattle baron came to take everything she owned. She did it because he was alive, and he was in front of her. And leaving a man bleeding in the dirt was not something the land, or she allowed. Out here, that was its own kind of law, unwritten, unforgiving, and older than any fence line Thayercroft had ever cut. The fever broke just before dawn. Willa knew it the moment she heard him stop thrashing. She'd been sitting in the chair by the supply room door for most of the night, dozing in short stretches, snapping awake every time he moved too much or went too quiet. When the first gray light started showing under the door crack, she got up and checked on him. His breathing had evened out. The clench had left his jaw. He was still pale under the dust and stubble, but the heat radiating off him had dropped to something closer to normal. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the way her mother had taught her, and decided he was going to live. She went to make coffee. By the time the sun was fully up and turning the yard orange, she had biscuits cooling on the rack and a full pot on the stove. She fed the two horses, his and hers, and checked the water level in the trough. Still enough for another day. After that, she'd have to hand pump from the well, which meant an hour of hard work in heat that was already climbing. She heard him moving around the time. She sat down with her own cup. Slow, deliberate sounds. A man being careful not to knock anything over. He appeared in the doorway of the kitchen a few minutes later. He was upright, which surprised her. He'd gotten the jacket back on, and he was holding his left side with one hand, fingers pressed to the bandage through his shirt. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He looked at her, and then at the kitchen, and then at the biscuits. "You didn't have to feed the horse," he said. It was hungry. She didn't look up from her cup. Coffee on the stove, biscuits on the rack. "Sit down before you fall down," he sat. Slowly, he poured himself a cup and wrapped both hands around it and just held it for a moment. She watched him without making it obvious that she was watching him. He wasn't a man who moved carelessly, even hurt, even barely on his feet. Everything he did was deliberate. "I owe you," he said. "You owe me an explanation." She set down her cup. "Who shot you?" He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. Something moved across his face. Not evasion. Exactly more like a man going through a door and deciding which things to bring with him and which to leave behind. "Disagreement over a job," he said. "What kind of job?" "Scouting. Land assessment." A pause. "I've done work for ranch operations, surveying territory, mapping water sources. I left my last employer on bad terms." It was the truth. She could feel it. It was also not the whole truth, and they both knew that too. She let it sit there between them on the table. "Can you work?" she asked. He blinked. That wasn't the question he'd expected. "I can work. How long before that side heals enough to be useful?" He thought about it. A week for the heavy stuff. 3 days for most things. Willa stood up. She got the biscuits from the rack and put them on the table between them. She sat back down and looked at him straight on. "Here's what I'll tell you," she said. "I'm a woman alone on a homestead with a broken fence, a stuck windmill, a well that needs reinforcing before the casing collapses, and a cattle baron who's given me 5 days to sign over my water rights. I have no time and no patience for anything except work and honesty. I don't know what you're running from. I don't particularly care. What I care about is what you can do and whether you'll do it straight." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you offering?" "Shelter, food, anonymity, if that's what you need." She folded her hands on the table. "In return, you fix my fence. You help me reinforce the well casing. And you teach me whatever you know about defending a piece of land from men who want to take it." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He turned his coffee cup around once, thinking it through. "All right," he said. "But I want to be clear about something. Go ahead. I'm not here to run your land." He met her eyes. "I'm not looking for a servant, and I've got no interest in owning anyone." Something in his voice made her believe it. Not the words by themselves. She'd heard plenty of men say decent words, but the flatness of it, like he was stating a fact the same way you'd state the temperature. She nodded. "Then we understand each other." She pushed the biscuits toward him. "Back east, women are treated like property," she said. Not angry. "Just matter of fact, the way you talk about weather. Out here, I own this land, and I own my life." He took a biscuit. "I know. Under this roof, that's not a debate." It's not a debate, he agreed. She picked up her cup again. You stay off the porch after sundown unless I invite you. You've got the supply room until you can build yourself something proper in the barn. My decisions about this property are mine. You can offer an opinion when I ask for one. He ate half the biscuit. That's fair. It's not about fair, she said. It's about clear. I find that clear's better. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. Clear is better, he repeated. She got up and cleared her cup to the basin. The wire cutters are on the hook by the back door. There's extra barbed wire coiled in the barn east wall. The fence runs south from the corner post. They cut about 40 feet of it yesterday. He stood slower than she had. I'll start there, after breakfast. She turned and looked at him. He was still pale. The side was still going to hurt. Sit down and finish eating, Rowan Hayes. The fence will wait 20 minutes. He sat back down. He ate 3 biscuits and had a second cup of coffee before he went out. She watched him through the kitchen window as he crossed the yard. He moved carefully, one arm slightly guarded, but he moved steadily. He found the wire cutters without any trouble. He paused at the fence corner, reading the damage, planning the repair before he started. A man who thought before he acted. There was something, at least. She went to do her own work. The morning passed in the way hard mornings do, task by task. No time to think about anything except what's directly in front of you. She mucked the horse stall. She hauled 2 buckets from the well and got the chickens their water. She patched the split in the leather saddle that had been annoying her for a week. Around mid-morning, she walked the south pasture line and checked how the remaining grass was holding. When she came back around the east side of the property, Rowan had half the fence line restrung. He was moving slower than he probably wanted to be moving. But every post was straight, and every strand of wire was pulled to the correct tension. She could see that even from a distance. She didn't say anything about it. She just noted it. At noon, she brought him water and a piece of cold salt pork wrapped in cloth. He took both without comment. They sat in the narrow strip of shade along the fence line and ate without talking much, which suited her fine. The windmill, she said at one point. The main gear is seized. I think it's rust in the pivot joint. I've gotten up there twice, but I can't get the right angle with my wrench to break it free. He looked at the windmill. I'll need the grease tin and a longer wrench. I have both. I'll look at it after the fence. They went back to work. She told herself she'd reserve judgment on him for a week. That was reasonable. A week of watching a person work tells you more about them than a month of conversation. And whatever else Rowan Hayes was carrying, whatever he'd left out of that thin explanation over coffee, he clearly knew how to work. She'd grant him that. She went back to her own list of things and tried not to think about Thayercroft and his 5-day clock. She tried and mostly failed. By late afternoon, Rowan had the fence finished. 40 feet of clean, tight wire, every post reset and tamped solid, the corner brace reinsured with a new stake. He came to the porch to return the tools, and she inspected his work and said nothing critical because there was nothing critical to say. That evening she made stew. She set a plate on the small table by the supply room door and knocked twice. He came to the door and took it. He said, "Thank you," she said. "Windmill tomorrow before it gets hot." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She went back inside. She sat at the table, where she and Eli used to eat dinner together. The chair across from her was empty, the same as it had been for 14 months. She ate her stew and listened to the evening sounds, a coyote somewhere out on the mesa, the dry tick of the cooling roof, the windmill's useless groan. 5 days, the man on the gray stallion had said. 4 days now. She stacked the dishes in the basin and went to bed. He came on the 4th night of Rowan's stay, and he came quietly. Willa heard the soft knock well after midnight. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. A deliberate pattern. Not a random traveler, not Croft's men, who wouldn't bother knocking. She'd lit the lamp before she heard the horse, because she was a light sleeper and always had been, and she brought the rifle with her to the door as a matter of habit. "Who's there?" she said through the wood. Josiah Mercer, a voice low and careful. "I have no quarrel with you, Mrs. Lawson. I was told a man here needed medical attention." She cracked the door. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, with a straight back and a well-worn coat that had been good quality once and was still respectable. A medical bag in his left hand. His face was calm, watchful, the face of a man who'd walked into uncertain situations before and knew to keep his expression neutral while he waited. She opened the door fully. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside and glanced at the rifle still in her hand and didn't make anything of it. She liked that. She set it against the wall and led him back to the supply room, where Rowan was still awake. He usually was. She'd noticed most of the night. Rowan saw Mercer, and his whole posture shifted. Not quite relief, something more guarded than relief, but he reached out a hand and Mercer took it. "You made it," Rowan said. "I said I would." Mercer set his bag on the crate beside the cot. "Let me see the wound." He examined Rowan thoroughly and in silence. His hands were sure and efficient, and he asked short, specific questions while he worked about fever, about appetite, about what felt right and what didn't. He cleaned the wound again, changed the packing, applied a different salve from a small green tin in his bag. Willa watched from the doorway. After a while she said, "You were with the Buffalo Soldiers." Mercer didn't look up from his work. "Ninth Cavalry, 8 years." He snipped the end of a piece of bandaging. "After that, I studied medicine, formally, at a college in Philadelphia. Graduated 1878. Set up practice where I could, which is not, in this territory, most places." She heard what he wasn't saying. She'd seen it in town, the way certain establishments looked at certain men, the way the word doctor got a pause before it, or an invisible quotation mark around it, depending on who was saying it. "You'll stay the night," she said. He did look up at that. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to create trouble for you." "Dr. Mercer." She met his eyes. "The man who wants to create trouble for me is Thayer Croft, and he's coming in 4 days, whether you're here or not. You rode through the dark to help someone on my property. The least I can do is offer you a meal and a bed." She paused. "That's not negotiable, incidentally." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression eased. "Then I accept." She went to put the kettle on. She brought him tea in the good porcelain, her mother's, packed in a crate from Ohio and hauled across 600 miles of territory, without a single chip. She set it on the dining table in the main room, where she and Eli had eaten every meal for the 3 years they had together. She pulled out the chair across from hers and gestured to it. "Sit down," she said. "Not in the back room here." He sat. He wrapped his hands around the porcelain cup, and she could see him registering what it meant, not just the tea, but the cup, the table, the chair, pulled out for him in the main room of the house. Rowan had made it to the main room on his own by then, moving slowly and holding the doorframe when he needed to. He dropped into the chair along the wall. He looked at Willa, setting out the biscuits she'd kept from supper. He looked at Mercer at the main table. He looked at Willa again. "Dr. Mercer," she said, sitting down across from him with her own cup. "How long have you been in the territory?" "Just over a year. I go where there are people, and no one else to help them." He sipped the tea. "Settlements, ranches, the army posts, occasionally. The soldiers don't always have decent medical care." He said it plainly, not looking for sympathy, just stating geography. "Do they let you treat the white soldiers?" "Sometimes." He set the cup down. "When there's no one else, or when the man is past caring. Mostly I treat the regiment, the families at the settlements, and whoever comes to me in the night." She nodded. She thought about what it took to keep showing up in the dark, for people who might or might not let you in, for year after year of it. Rowan said from the wall chair, "Josiah's the best field surgeon I've ever seen. I watched him save a man's leg in a tent, in a thunderstorm, with no proper light, and about 4 inches of space." "I had enough light," Mercer said. "You had half a candle." "That was enough." Willa refilled Mercer's cup without being asked. She said to Rowan, "Under this roof, a man is judged by what his hands build, not the color of his skin." Rowan looked at her. I know that, Willa. I wasn't saying it for your benefit. She was saying it out loud because it mattered to say it out loud. Some things need to be spoken into the air of a room, not just understood silently. I was saying it because Dr. Mercer has spent a year out here riding in at midnight through the back roads and probably not eating enough, and I want him to know that this is a table where he can sit in the front chair and drink out of the good cups and not wonder about anything. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Mrs. Lawson. Willa, he said carefully, a small nod. She passed him the biscuits. They talked for a while about the drought, about the territory, about the nearest town and the state of things there. Mercer knew things about the wider situation that she didn't. He traveled far, and people talked to him because doctors hear things that other men don't. He told her that two other small homesteaders east of town had already signed over their water rights to Croft under pressure she could guess at. He told her that Sheriff Garrett had 3 new deputies, all of them imported from out of territory, which meant Croft had spent money on them. She listened and didn't show on her face what she was thinking. After Mercer turned in, she gave him the proper bedroom and slept herself on the divan. She sat for another hour at the table, with the lamp turned low, and thought through what he'd said. Croft was moving faster than she'd realized. He wasn't just pressuring her. He was building something systematic. Water rights, bought sheriff, fresh muscle. The homestead wasn't just a property to him. It was the last piece of something larger, which meant that the well under her feet was more valuable than she'd understood. She wasn't sure if that made her position stronger or more dangerous. Probably both. The next morning came in bright and crushing, and she had the coffee on early. She'd half expected Rowan to sleep, but he was up before full light and in the yard when she went to the window. He'd gotten the long wrench from the barn, the heavy iron one she'd tried, and failed to get sufficient leverage with, and he was climbing the windmill frame, moving carefully, taking his time on each rung. But climbing, she watched. He got to the gear housing, 20 feet up, and she held her breath in spite of herself. He found the seized pivot joint and worked the wrench slowly, rocking it back and forth rather than forcing it, which told her he understood what rust does to iron and how to coax it rather than break it. It took 20 minutes, then something gave, and the blades shuddered, and in the dry morning air, there was just enough of a breeze coming down from the mesa to catch them. The windmill turned. The pump clanked. Water began to move in the pipe below. She let out the breath she'd been holding. Rowan climbed back down. He stood at the base of the windmill and looked up at the turning blades for a moment. He didn't celebrate. He just watched it work and then turned back toward the barn. She was already at the supply line situation by then, going through what she had left and what she needed in town. Flour, salt, a new lamp wick, harness leather, normal things. Except that Croft had people in town now, and going in alone on the road meant passing through 3 miles of territory where Croft's riders had been cutting fences. She was still working it through at the kitchen table when Rowan came in for water. She told him about the supply situation without planning to. She was thinking out loud, mostly, and he listened with his cup in his hand and didn't interrupt. Where does he post his riders? Rowan asked. The creek crossing and the Mercantile Road junction, according to what Dr. Mercer said last night. Rowan nodded slowly. He set his cup down. If I go east along the Mesa Base and cut through the Callaway Canyon, I can come into town from the north side. They'll know your face if they see you. Not from the north side, they won't. Croft's men watch the roads coming out of Homestead Country. They're not watching the canyon approach because it's rough and nobody uses it. He said it like he was describing a chessboard. I can have your supplies back by dark. She looked at him, without firing a shot. Without firing a shot, she studied him for another moment. Why do you know that canyon? A pause. Shorter this time. I've scouted this territory. Mapped most of the water sources between here and the valley. I know where the roads are and where the roads aren't. She thought about what he was admitting to and what he was still not saying. She thought about the fact that a man who had scouted water sources for land operations in this territory had clearly worked for someone, and the most obvious candidate for who that someone was made her jaw tighten. But the fence was fixed. The windmill was running, and he'd offered to walk 6 rough miles through canyon country with a cracked rib to get her flour and salt without firing a shot. She'd reserved judgment one more day. "Take the gray horse," she said. "He's steadier on rock than mine." He nodded and got up. She wrote the supply list on a piece of paper and folded it and gave it to him along with the money from the tin she kept in the second drawer. He put both in his coat pocket without counting the money, which she noticed. He was back before sunset as promised. Flour, salt, the lamp wick, the harness leather, everything on the list, plus a small paper twist of peppermint candy that she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. She looked at it. "The woman at the dry goods counter put it in," he said. He wasn't looking at her. "She said to give her regards to you." Willa picked up the candy. She didn't say anything for a moment. "That's Hazel Briggs," she said. "She was at my wedding. She asked how you were holding up. I said you were holding up well." He set the rest of the supplies on the kitchen table. "I didn't think you'd want me saying anything else." She put the peppermint in her apron pocket. "No, that was right." She started putting the flour away. He helped without being asked, getting the heavy sack up onto the shelf without wincing too visibly, though she could see it cost him something. "Thank you," she said, "for going. It's what I said I'd do." She nodded. Outside, the windmill was still turning. She could hear it. A steady creak and rhythm that had been missing for 3 days. The water was moving in the pipe. The fence was whole. The supplies were on the shelf. None of it solved the larger problem. Croft was still coming. The clock was still running. But the day had been something other than a loss. That was enough to build on. She made supper. She set the table for 3, because Mercer was staying one more day before he had to move on. They ate together in the main room, with the lamp turned up and the door open to whatever thin evening air the mesa offered. And for a little while, it felt less like a siege and more like a home. She noticed that. She didn't make anything of it. She just noticed it. The heat didn't break at sundown. It never did anymore. It just shifted, stopped being a white pressing thing, and became something darker instead. Still there. Still sitting on the land like a hand that wouldn't lift. Willa had started leaving. The windows cracked at night for whatever air moved, even though it was barely cooler than the air inside. She'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours when the smell reached her. Smoke, not wood smoke from a dying cook fire, not the dry grass smell she'd grown used to when the wind blew off the mesa. This was thick and orange hot and wrong. And she was out of the divan and moving before she was fully awake, pulling her boots on by instinct, grabbing the rifle from the wall. She got to the door and opened it, and the night-lit a hay barn was burning. Not smoldering, not just catching, burning, the whole south wall already gone, the fire eating upward through the dry timber with a ferocity that only comes when someone helps it along. Orange and yellow, and that particular blue-white at the base. That means it's burning hot enough to be almost unfighting. And from inside the barn, she could hear the horses. She ran. She was halfway across the yard when Rowan hit the ground running beside her. She didn't know where he'd come from, whether he'd smelled it too or heard it first. It didn't matter. He was there, and he was pulling his shirt up over his face against the smoke, and he reached the barn door a half step ahead of her. "Horses first," he said, just that, no planned discussion. She pulled the door bar up, and he yanked it open, and the heat came out at them like a wall. Her eyes watered immediately. The smoke inside was thick and low, and the animals were panicking. She could hear them kicking the stall boards, that hollow, frantic sound, the sound of animals, that can smell what's coming. Willa went for her mare. The horse was rolling her eyes white and slamming against the stall wall, and Willa grabbed her halter with both hands and talked to her low and steady, nonsense words, just sound and tone. and pulled her toward the door. The horse resisted for one terrible second. Then she lurched forward, and Willa moved with her and got her out into the yard. Rowan got the gray next, then the mule, then the two goats that had been sheltering in the far corner. He moved fast, not reckless, fast, controlled fast, knowing where each animal was, not wasting motion. His side had to be screaming at him. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he held himself slightly tilted, but he didn't slow down. 3 minutes, maybe 4, all the animals out, and none of them dead. Then they went for the barn itself. There was no saving the hay, it was already gone. Just feeding the fire now, but the tools were another matter. The good tools, the breaking plow, the post driver, the seeder that had cost Eli $60 and 2 months of savings. Willa went in through the side door with a wet cloth over her face and dragged what she could out while Rowan worked the bucket line from the trough. He'd found the bucket himself, found the trough, started the line without anyone telling him to. She passed him loaded buckets on her way out with tools, and he threw water at the outer walls to keep the fire from jumping to the chicken coop. They worked in that ugly, focused way that comes when there's no time for fear. Just the task, just the next thing. Then the sound of a gunshot cracked across the yard from somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence, and Willa's heart slammed against her ribs. Not at her. A warning shot. Or maybe just craftsmen watching the fire and celebrating. And Rowan stopped. She noticed it before she understood it. He'd been moving bucket in hand, turning toward the trough, and then he just wasn't moving anymore. He was standing still in the smoke and the firelight, and his face had gone somewhere else entirely. The fire crackled. Another piece of the roof gave way. Sparks erupted upward in a column of orange light, and somewhere out in the dark, another shot. Just one. Far off, probably nothing. But Rowan's hand went loose, and the bucket hit the ground, and he was somewhere that wasn't this yard. In the summer, his chest going fast and shallow, his eyes fixed on the burning roof. She knew it before she could name it. She'd heard Dr. Mercer talk about it. Once men who'd seen enough violence that the sounds and the light could pull them back, there involuntarily, against every effort of will. She'd heard it and filed it as information. Now it was standing in front of her. She dropped what she was carrying. She crossed to him in 4 steps, and she grabbed his hand. Hard, both of hers around his one. She didn't say anything soothing. She didn't soften her voice or speak to him like he was fragile. She just held on and said, "Rowan, the ground under your feet, feel it. That's red mesa clay. You're here." He didn't respond immediately. "The trough is 12 feet to your left," she said steady. "Factual. My mare is behind you. I need your hands, right now." He blinked. His chest slowed slightly. His eyes moved slowly, coming back from wherever they'd gone, and landed on her face. She held on and waited. He came back the rest of the way. Not all at once. Like a man surfacing from water. She could see it happen, the focus returning to his eyes, the present settling back around him. "I've got it," he said, low. She released his hand. She picked up the bucket he'd dropped. She gave it to him. He took it. He turned back to the trough. He started working again. She went back to dragging tools. Neither of them said anything about it. It took another 20 minutes to stop the fire from spreading. They didn't save the barn. It came down in the end, all that dry timber, folding in on itself with a long grinding crash that sent sparks 20 feet into the night air. But the coop survived. The tool shed survived. The horses were safe, and the goats were safe, and the mule was somewhere behind the house complaining about it loudly, but alive. When it was over, they stood in the yard, both of them covered in ash and sweat, the smoking ruin of the barn between them and the sky. Willa's arms were shaking. She hadn't noticed while she was working. She noticed now. She sat down on the ground, just sat down in the dirt because her legs wanted her to, and she wasn't going to argue with them. Rowan sat beside her, not close, just nearby. He braced his arms on his knees and looked at what was left of the barn. "They came for the hay," he said. "So you'd have nothing to feed the stock through winter? Push you towards selling before it gets cold, I know. Her voice was flat with exhaustion. I should have expected a move like this. Neither of us expected it tonight. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a long breath. We'll rebuild. Croft doesn't know what I've got in reserve timber behind the East Ridge. A pause. I'll help you build it. She looked at him. He was still looking at the ruin. His profile in the dying firelight was smoke-darkened and tired, and she noticed because she couldn't help noticing steady. He'd come back from wherever he'd gone, and he'd kept working. She thought about what that cost a person. To come back from that place and keep going. She thought about what Dr. Mercer had said, carefully and obliquely, about the men he'd treated. Not the physical wounds, the other kind. How they don't heal on their own. How they need time and patience and the right conditions. And even then, it's not a straight line. She wasn't going to ask about it tonight. That wasn't what either of them needed tonight. The fence stayed, she said finally. Yeah. Windmill's still running. Yeah. She looked up at the stars, that same hard brilliance from the drought sky. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Most of them are. She got up, she offered him a hand, and he took it and got up beside her. They stood there for a moment, both of them looking at the smoking wreckage of the barn, and she thought about Eli building it, post by post, that first winter. Then she thought about building it again. Come on, she said. I've got cold coffee on the stove. He followed her inside. She put the cold coffee on to reheat, and he sat at the kitchen table, and she sat across from him, and they drank it black and didn't say much of anything. It was the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. She was grateful for it. Out on the yard, the last of the fire went to ember and smoke. They sat there until the coffee was gone, and then they went to their separate rooms, and what was left of the night passed quietly. Croft's men didn't come back, not that night. 3 days later, Thayer Croft came himself. He came in the morning, which was tactical, she could see it in the choice. Mid-morning, when the heat was already building, when a person was deep enough into their day's work that they were tired, but not yet at the steady rhythm of the afternoon. He came with Sheriff Garrett on one side and 4 riders behind him. Willa saw them from the garden before they reached the gate. She straightened up from the bean row and walked to the porch and picked up the Winchester that lived against the post there. Rowan was at the south fence line. He'd seen them too. She could tell, by the way, he went still. Croft rode through the gate without asking. He was a big man, broad through the chest, a graying beard kept neat, dressed in the clothes of a man who'd built wealth and wanted you to see it on him. His horse was better than his men's horses. Everything about him was a statement. Sheriff Garrett rode at his right. Garrett was a thin, sun-worn man, with a badge that sat crooked on his vest. He had the particular look of a man who'd made a bad bargain and knew it, and had made his peace with it. Croft stopped in the yard. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. He had a voice built for rooms larger than this. "I see my men's message didn't persuade you. Your men's message burned my barn," she said. "Send me a bill for the hay and I'll frame it." His eyes moved to Rowan, who had come up from the fence line and was standing at the edge of the yard. Something happened in Croft's face, a stillness, the calculation of a man rearranging his approach. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out to Garrett, who brought his horse forward and held it out toward Willa. "This is a mortgage note," Croft said, "signed by your husband, Elias Lawson, 3 years ago, in exchange for the capital to establish this homestead. The note is in default. Repayment was due 6 months after his death." Willa took the paper. She unfolded it. She looked at it carefully. She knew Eli's signature. She'd seen it on 100 documents: the homestead filing, the water claim, the supply contracts, their marriage certificate. She could draw it herself from memory if she had to. The signature on this paper was not Eli's signature. Close. Someone had worked at it. But the second L was wrong, and Eli always crossed his Z with a slight upward angle, and this one didn't, and she'd know it anywhere. "This note," she said, "is a forgery." "That's a serious accusation," Croft said. He didn't sound troubled by it. It's a serious document. She folded it back up, and I'll be presenting it to a judge along with every legitimate document my husband ever signed. Any document examiner in this territory will see what I see in about 30 seconds. The local judge, Garrett said, and she could hear the faint sourness in his voice, the sound of a man delivering a line he'd been told to deliver, has already reviewed this note and found it valid. She looked at Garrett. He didn't quite meet her eyes. Of course he has, she said. Croft's gaze went back to Rowan. He rode his horse forward a few steps, and his voice shifted still loud, still carrying, but now aimed at everyone in the yard. Perhaps I should introduce my former employee to anyone here who doesn't know him. Willa didn't move. Rowan didn't move. Rowan Hayes, Croft said. Scout, tracker, and land assessor. Worked for my operation for 14 months. He was very good at identifying vulnerable properties and mapping the resources on them. His smile was thin and flat. He has mapped this homestead, including the aquifer depth, the casing quality of your well, and the dry season yield. He gave me that report himself. She heard it. She felt it, a cold displacement in her chest, like a stone dropping into still water. She looked at Rowan. His jaw was set. He was looking at Croft. He gave you that report, she said. Not to Croft, to Rowan. He did. Croft's voice was satisfied. It was the voice of a man playing a card he'd been holding for weeks. Rowan turned to look at her. Then, I gave him that report before I left his employment, before I knew whose land it was, before I understood what he intended to do with it. His voice was even, but she could hear what was under it. When I understood what he intended to do with it, I left. You left, Croft said pleasantly, because you refused to carry out a job. A job I asked you to do and paid you to do, and that you refused at the last moment, which cost me considerably. The yard was very quiet. The windmill turned. The heat pressed down. What job? Willa said. Rowan looked at her. He said plainly, without flinching, Croft wanted your husband dead before the water claim could be finalized. He wanted it to look like an accident on the road. I refused to do it. The silence afterward was absolute. She looked at Rowan and saw no evasion in his face. She looked at Croft and saw the slight tightening around his eyes that a man gets when something true has been said out loud that he'd rather had stayed unsaid. That's a lie, Croft said. The pleasantness was gone, and this man has outstanding warrants in the territory for fraud and desertion of contracted employment. That's not a warrant, Rowan said. It is now. Croft nodded to Garrett. Garrett didn't look happy about it. He looked like a man doing a job he'd agreed to do, and wishing he hadn't. He dismounted and walked toward Rowan with the chains already in his hands, and Willa brought the rifle up. Stop right there, she said. Mrs. Lawson. Garrett's voice was tired. Don't make this worse. You're arresting a man on a forged warrant in my yard. It's already as bad as it gets. Stop walking. Garrett stopped. He looked at her rifle. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the 4 riders behind Croft, all of them with hands resting near holsters. Rowan said quietly, Willa, don't. She kept the rifle up. Willa. His voice was steady, not commanding, just clear. There are 4 of them, and 1 warrant that'll get thrown out the moment a legitimate judge sees it. And if you fire that rifle right now, they'll have grounds for something that won't get thrown out. Put it down. She looked at him. Her hands were steady. It was her chest that wasn't. He looked back at her. He gave her the smallest nod. Trust me on this. She lowered the rifle. Garrett moved forward. Put the chains on Rowan's wrists, iron manacles. The old kind, heavy and without grace. Rowan held still for it. He didn't resist. He watched Willa watching him. Then, one of Croft's riders dismounted, a big man, broad shoulders, the kind of person who'd been hired for his size, and he walked toward Rowan with his fist already coming. That's not necessary, Garrett said, and didn't move to stop it. The first blow hit Rowan across the jaw. His head snapped to the side, and he didn't go down. He planted his feet and took it, because his hands were chained and there was nothing else to do. Willa stepped forward. Rowan moved, even chained. Even with the broken ribib and the healing side, he turned his body and put himself between Willa and the rider and took the second blow across the side of his head, the one that had been meant to push past him and reach her. He went to one knee. "That's enough," Croft said, calm, like a man calling off a dog. The rider stepped back. Rowan breathed. He was bleeding from the cheek now, and his left eye was starting to swell. He looked up at Willa from one knee, and there was nothing in his face she hadn't seen before. Pain. Yes, and the careful management of it, and underneath that, something else she didn't have a clean word for. "Sign the deed," Croft said to her. "You have 5 days. At the end of 5 days, if that signature isn't on my desk, I'll find other methods." She looked at him. She kept her voice flat. "Get off my land." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. His riders turned with him. 2 of them yanked Rowan up by the chain between his wrists and walked him toward the road. Garrett paused at the gate. He didn't look at her, he said quietly. To the fence post he was looking at, county seat has a land records office. Territorial deed law, 1,875. You might find something useful there. Then he rode away. She didn't move until the dust closed behind them. She stood in her yard with the rifle at her side and the forged mortgage document in her other hand and watched them take Rowan Hayes down the road in iron chains, bleeding, and she didn't let her face show anything because there was no one left to show it to. When they were out of sight, she looked down at the document in her hand. County seat, land records office. Territorial deed law, 1,875. Garrett was bought, but he wasn't entirely gone. She went inside. She sat at the table. Eli's table, her table, the table where Dr. Mercer had drunk from the good porcelain, and she spread the forged document out in front of her. She got out Eli's letters, the supply contracts, the water claim filing. She laid them beside each other. She looked at the signatures for a long time. Then she got out her pen and her good paper. And she started writing to the county seat, to the Territorial Records Office, to the name of a lawyer she'd heard mentioned once by Hazel Briggs at the dry goods counter. She wrote until the lamp needed refilling. Outside 5 days on Croft's clock. The yard was empty and quiet. The windmill turned, pulling water up from the ground her husband had claimed and she had kept. She was alone. Really alone, the way she hadn't been since the first days after Eli. She folded the letters and sealed them. Tomorrow she'd find a way to get them out without going through town. Callaway, Canyon maybe. The route Rowan had used, she allowed herself, for exactly the space of one breath, to think about him being dragged down that road in chains, bleeding, having put himself between her and the fist that was coming for her. One breath. Then she set her jaw and started planning. He'd said the warrant would be thrown out. She was going to make sure it was. She was going to do it on her own terms, through legitimate law and documented evidence, and she was going to do it before Croft's 5 days ran out. She was a widow alone on a drought-struck homestead in a territory where the law was for sale. She was also the woman who had strung 40 feet of barbed wire herself in 100-degree heat, who had cleaned a stranger's wound in the middle of the night, who had held onto a man's hand in a burning yard and pulled him back from wherever the fire had sent him. She was not signing anything, and she was not waiting to be saved. The storm had been building since midday. Willa could feel it before she could see it. A change in the air pressure, a thickness in the heat that was different from the usual summer wait. By mid-afternoon, the western sky had gone a greenish-gray, the color that experienced people in this territory had learned to respect. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in an hour, which out here, in drought season, felt like a gift and a warning at the same time. She'd spent the 2 days since Rowan was taken doing what needed doing. She'd gotten the letters out through the canyon route. She'd sent word to Dr. Mercer through the supply rider, who passed the East Road on Tuesdays. She'd gone through every document Eli had ever signed and organized them into a leather satchel with a brass clasp. She'd visited the county seat's records office herself, on horseback, before dawn, coming back the long way. She had what she needed for the courthouse. She'd been building the case with her own hands, document by document. She hadn't slept much. She was at the kitchen table, with the papers spread out, when she heard the horse. One horse, moving slow. She was at the door before she'd made a conscious decision to move, the rifle already in her hand. She opened the door. The gray horse was standing at the edge of the yard in the first dim flicker of lightning from the west, and on the gray horse, barely upright, Rowan. He was slumped forward over the saddle horn, both arms hanging, and the sight of it knocked the breath out of her because it was so precisely like the first night she'd seen him, except this time she knew his name. She knew his hands and his work and the way he came back from the fire even when he didn't want to. She got down the steps and across the yard. Fast Rowan. She grabbed the horse's bridle and got close. "Rowan, look at me." He turned his head. One eye was swollen, mostly shut. There was dried blood along his jaw and a fresh cut above his eyebrow that had bled down into his hair. He was breathing in short. Pulls the broken rib, she guessed, or something new added to it. "Got loose," he said. His voice was rough and thin. "Mercer, he helped." "I know. I sent for him." She got her arm up. "Can you get down?" "Probably not gracefully." "I'm not grading you." "Come down." He came down. It wasn't graceful. She took as much of his weight as she could manage, which was not all of it, and they crossed the yard together in the rising wind. The first real rumble of thunder rolled over the mesa. The lightning was closer now, and the sky to the west had gone the color of a bruise. She got him inside. She got him to the main room, this time not the supply room, the main room, and got him onto the cot she'd moved there when she'd thought she might need it. She lit the kerosene lamp, turned it up enough to see. He was worse than the first time. The ribs were the obvious injury she could see the way he was protecting his left side. The way every breath was a controlled decision. The face was bad, but faces heal. She pressed her fingers carefully along his side and felt the catch in his breath at one particular spot. "That one's new," she said. "Courtesy of Croft's man, before Garrett made them stop." "Garrett made them stop?" "Eventually." His voice had a dry edge to it. "He's a complicated individual." She got the basin, got the clean cloth and the clean water. She pulled a chair to the side of the cot and sat down and started working on his face. First, the cut above the eyebrow, the split along his jaw. Her hands were steady. She'd made them steady 2 nights ago, and she'd kept them that way since. The lamp threw a warm circle of light across the cot and the chair, and the both of them. Outside, the thunder was rolling in longer, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the window glass. She cleaned the cuts with careful, thorough strokes. He held still under her hands and didn't make a sound, which told her everything about how much pain he was already managing if this didn't register as worth reacting to. She got the bandaging for his ribs. She helped him sit part way up, and she wound the linen in close, tight loops around his chest, pulling each pass snug before securing it. She'd been holding herself together for 2 days, planning, writing, organizing, building the case, staying in motion. Because motion was the only thing that kept the fear from sitting down inside her and staying there. Now she was here, in the lamplight, and he was back, and the fear was looking for somewhere to land. She pulled the bandage tight and secured the end of the linen with a firm knot. She was aware of her hands, aware that they were not entirely steady for the first time in 2 days. She kept her face arranged and her voice measured. "I don't need saving," she said. She hadn't meant it the way it came out. She'd meant it as information, as a statement of the position they were both in. She'd been working the problem. She had a plan. She didn't need anyone to ride in and fix it for her. She'd meant it practically. But it came out with something else underneath it, something she hadn't meant to say out loud. Rowan turned his head, slowly. He looked at her for a moment with his one good eye, and the other one nearly swollen shut, and then he did something she wasn't expecting. He turned toward her, carefully, working with the pain rather than against it, and he rested his forehead against her hip. Just that. A gentle, deliberate weight. His eyes closed. All the tension of the past 2 days, All the iron he'd been holding himself with, she could feel it leave him. One long breath at a time, the cowboy whispered. Then take care of me. She didn't move. She let the words sit in the room. Outside, the storm cracked open. Real rain hit the windows, not the gentle preliminary drops, but the full weight of it. The kind of rain this territory had been waiting for weeks. It hammered the roof and ran in sheets off the eaves, and she could hear it swallowing up the yard and the mesa, and everything beyond. Her hand moved to his hair, lightly. She wasn't thinking about it. He exhaled, a long, surrendered breath. She stayed still for a while and let the storm be loud and let the lamplight be warm, and let him be right there in front of her, where she could see he was alive and accounted for. Then she said quietly, "Are you hungry?" A pause. "Yes, I've got cold beans and cornbread." "That sounds like the best thing I've ever heard." She moved, carefully, and he straightened back up on the cot. She went to the kitchen and came back with the beans heated on the small stove and cornbread wrapped in cloth. She set it on the crate beside him and sat back down, in the chair. He ate slowly, and she told him what she'd done while he was gone: the letters, the county seat, the records office. The documents spread out on the table in the other room. He listened with the focused attention she'd come to recognize in him, not just hearing, but tracking, filing it away, and cross-referencing it against what he already knew. "The forged signature," he said between spoonfuls of beans. "Do you have Eli's water claim filing?" "In the satchel. If you put them side by side, the second L is wrong." She looked at him. "I know. I saw it." A pause. "Of course you did. The Z is wrong, too." He almost smiled. His jaw wouldn't quite let him. "Of course it is." She leaned back in the chair. The rain was steady now, a long, soaking rain, the real kind, and she thought about the aquifer under their feet, drinking it in, the mesa soaking up what it hadn't had in months. "Garrett told me something," she said, before he rode away. "What did he say?" "Territorial deed law, 1875. She paused. "He said it like he was leaving me a door." Rowan set down the spoon. He looked at the floor for a moment. "That law has a provision for independent female property ownership when a homestead is filed jointly and the male partner dies. The surviving spouse retains full legal authority over the land and all attached claims. No subsequent mortgage can be applied without the widow's signature at time of creation." She looked at him. "You know territorial law." "I spent 14 months in this territory mapping land and water rights. You have to know the law to know what can and can't be taken." He met her eyes. "Croft's note, even if it were genuine, would require your signature on it too, because Eli's alone wasn't sufficient under the 1875 statute. It's not a forged signature that kills his case, it's the wrong names on the document entirely." The room was quiet, except for the rain. "He didn't know I knew that provision," she said. "He doesn't know most women know it. He's counted on that a long time." She looked at the satchel on the table across the room. Her letters, her documents, her 2 days of careful work. She'd been building toward the courthouse already. But this was the load-bearing beam. This was the thing that made the whole structure stand. "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded. Then he winced. The nod had been too much. "Stop moving your head," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She refilled his water cup. He drank it. The rain kept coming, heavy and relentless, and outside she could hear the first trickle in the dry creek bed at the south edge of the property. Just beginning, just starting to run. The land drinking, the land coming back. She looked at him sitting on the cot, beaten up and wrapped in bandaging, eating cornbread in a lamplight circle, with the storm going on outside, and she thought about 2 people who had come to the same stretch of red mesa from opposite directions and for opposite reasons, and had ended up here, in this room, on this night. She didn't make anything large out of it. She just noticed it and let it be true. "Get some sleep," she said. "I need you functional tomorrow. I'll sleep when the rain slows." The rain is not slowing. He looked at the window. The rain hammered the glass like it had a point to make. "No, it's not." He settled back against the pillow. "Willa." She was already getting up. She paused. "Thank you," he said, "for not signing." She picked up the empty bowl. "I wasn't going to sign, I know." A pause. "I knew it before they finished the sentence." She took the bowl to the kitchen. She stood at the basin for a moment, with the rain going on outside, and the lamp throwing its circle of warmth through the doorway into the main room. She went back and checked that the lamp wouldn't tip in the night. She got a second blanket from the chest and laid it over the foot of the cot. She went to her own room. She lay down and listened to the rain for a long time before she slept. She rode into town at 7 in the morning. The storm had broken sometime after midnight, leaving the roads wet and the air scrubbed clean in a way that almost felt like a different territory. The red clay was dark with moisture. The creek she crossed on the way to town was actually running not much, not deep, but moving water where there had been cracked mud, and she let her mare stand in it for a moment on the way across, because it seemed right. She had the leather satchel across her lap. Everything she needed was in it. The original water claim. Eli's genuine signatures on 6 different documents. The forged mortgage note. Her own written argument, which she'd drafted and redrafted until it was tight and exact and left no room for interpretation. And the Homestead Act in print with the relevant sections underlined in red ink. Rowan had wanted to come with her. She'd told him no. "You're a wanted man on a warrant that hasn't been vacated yet," she'd said. At 6 in the morning, while he was trying to find a version of sitting up that didn't aggravate the ribs. "You ride into town with me and Garrett arrests you again before we get through the door. You stay here?" He'd looked like he wanted to argue. He hadn't argued. "Lock the gate," she'd told him. "If anyone comes up the road who isn't me, fire 1 shot in the air and get to the ridge. I'll hear it." She'd ridden out before he could find the words for whatever he'd been about to say. The town was quiet at this hour. The main street was still wet, the boardwalks dark with moisture. The usual dust settled for once. She tied the mare at the post. In front of the courthouse, a 2-story building in sandstone that looked more permanent than most things in the territory, and she went up the steps with her satchel. The town council met twice monthly in the lower courtroom. It wasn't a full court of law. This wasn't a circuit judge's day, but it was a public body with legal standing to hear property disputes. And that was what she'd filed for 3 weeks ago, before any of this started. Just to have it on the record. Just in case. She was glad she had. There were 11 people in the room when she walked in, the 3 council members behind the long table at the front, a clerk at the side desk, 4 townspeople who attended these sessions out of habit or curiosity, and at the far wall, making no attempt to be about his presence, 2 of Croft's riders in clean shirts. The council chair was a man named Aldous Petty, who had the particular look of a man who had made many small compromises over many years and told himself each time that it was just this once. He looked at Willa when she walked in and then looked at the wall just past her left ear. She walked to the front table and set down her satchel. "I'm here on the matter of the Lawson Homestead water claim," she said, "filed 3 weeks ago under Article 7 of the Territorial Property Code." Petty shuffled his papers. "Mrs. Lawson?" "Yes, we've reviewed the matter. Have you reviewed the Homestead Act of 1862, Article 4, regarding the property rights of female claimants? In the event of spousal death," she opened the satchel, "because I'd like to walk the council through it." She laid the documents on the table. Not quickly, deliberately. One at a time, in the order she'd planned. The original homestead filing with Eli's signature. The water claim filing with both their signatures, because she'd been present and she'd signed it too, which Croft apparently hadn't known or hadn't expected to matter. The 6 other documents with Eli's genuine signature. The forged mortgage note. She lined them up and she said, clearly, so the clerk was getting it down, under the Homestead Act of 1862, and under the Territorial Deed Law of 1875, a jointly filed homestead claim cannot be encumbered by mortgage without the signatures of both parties at the time of creation. This water claim was filed jointly. My signature is on the original document. Any subsequent mortgage on this claim requires my signature. This mortgage note she touched the forged document does not contain my signature. Under territorial law, it is not valid. It wouldn't be valid even if it weren't a forgery, but it is also a forgery, and I can demonstrate that to any document examiner in the territory. She stepped back from the table. The room was quiet. Petty looked at the documents. He looked at 2 fellow council members. He looked at Croft's riders at the wall. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, as if hoping for guidance from that direction. Mrs. Lawson, he said, the council has received information suggesting the claim is under dispute. The claim is not under dispute, she said. The claim is recorded, properly filed, and legally sound. What is under dispute is a forged document being presented as grounds for seizure of legally held property. She met his eyes. That's not a property matter, Aldous. That's a criminal matter. And I have sent copies of this document to the Territorial Attorney General's office in the capital, along with a full account of events, including the burning of my barn and the fraudulent arrest of a man on my property. Those letters went out 2 days ago. The room got quieter. One of Croft's riders shifted against the wall. Furthermore, she said, the Homestead Act guarantees the right of a claimant to work and maintain their land without unlawful interference. Cutting my fence line and burning my barn are both unlawful interference, and I have witnesses to both. Petty looked down at the documents. He picked up the forged mortgage note. He set it down. He picked up the original water claim and looked at the signatures at the bottom. He knew she could see it on his face. He'd known before she walked in. The question was whether he was going to do anything about it. The council will take this matter under advisement, he said. The council will issue a ruling today, she said. Flat, definite. I have ridden here on a wet road with documented evidence and a clear legal argument. The law is not ambiguous. The only question is whether this council applies it. Petty looked at the 2 other council members. One of them, a woman named Harriet Cole, who ran the millinery shop and who had known Eli from the supply auctions, gave a small, firm nod. The other member looked at the floor. Petty took a breath. He straightened his papers. He said, in a careful, official voice, on the matter of the Lawson Homestead water claim, the council finds the claim valid and legally held under the terms of the original filing. The mortgage document presented by the Croft Land and Cattle Operation is a pause. The pause of a man choosing his words with a cautious hand, inconsistent with the legal requirements for encumbrance of a jointly held claim. She waited. The council further notes that the document has been referred to the Territorial Attorney General and recommends that the Sheriff's Office conduct no further actions against the Lawson Homestead pending review by that office. Harriet Cole said clearly, for the record, so noted. Willa put her documents back in the satchel. She fastened the brass clasp. She said, thank you for your time. She walked out. She walked down the courthouse steps and untied her mare and stood for a moment on the wet street. The morning sun was out properly now, and it hit the wet buildings and the wet road and made everything look briefly like it had been rinsed clean. She'd won this round. She knew it, and she felt it a solid, grounded satisfaction. Not relief, satisfaction, which is different. Because relief means you were afraid it wouldn't happen, and satisfaction means you built it right, and it held. She also knew it wasn't over. Petty had said, inconsistent with legal requirements. He hadn't said forged. He hadn't said Croft's name in a negative sentence. And the sheriff's office, conducting no actions pending review, was not the same as the warrant against Rowan being vacated. The Territorial Attorney General was real. The letters were real. But Croft had money and time and reach, and those things didn't disappear because the small town council issued a careful ruling. She put her foot in the stirrup and got up on the mare. She had the ruling. It was documented. It was on the record. It bought time and it established a foundation And law even bent law, even bought law cares about what's on the record, because the record is what holds when everything else shifts. She pointed the mare home. Two of Croft's riders came out of the courthouse behind her. She heard their boots on the steps. She didn't look back. She kept the mare to a steady walk down the main street, past Hazel Briggs's dry goods store, past the blacksmith, past the edge of town, and on to the wet clay road. They followed her for a mile. Then they turned back. She kept riding. The creek she'd crossed on the way in was running a little higher on the way back. The rain had soaked in enough overnight to keep feeding it. She crossed it and felt the cold water splash up and didn't mind. When she got back to the homestead, the gate was locked and Rowan was on the porch with a rifle across his lap. He stood when he saw her coming, waited until she'd come through the gate and up to the rail. "Well," he said. She tied the mare and climbed the porch steps and handed him the council ruling, folded inside the satchel. He read it. He looked up. They found it inconsistent with legal requirements. They did. Not forged. Not in those words. But it's on record. He nodded. His jaw was still swollen, and the eye was still bad, but he'd been moving around. She could see it in the way he was standing. He handed the document back. "The warrant," she said, "still active. Until the Attorney General's office responds." "I know." She put the document back in the satchel. "We're not done." "No," he agreed. She went inside. The morning was already heating up again, the brief mercy of the storm already being absorbed by the land's thirst. She put the kettle on and opened the satchel on the table. She looked at the papers, the foundation she'd built. Croft was not done either. She knew that better than anything, but she had something on the record now, and a copy in the Capitol, and a council ruling that could not be quietly erased. She had ground to stand on. That was enough to keep standing. The second storm came 3 days after the first. This one announced itself differently, not the greenish sky and the pressure drop, but a slow, dark wall moving in from the northwest in the early afternoon, so wide it swallowed the horizon from one side to the other. The mesa went from red to purple to nearly black as the clouds rolled over it. By the time Willa had the horses in and the chickens secured and the loose equipment tied down, the first real gusts were hitting the yard. Then the rain came, and it didn't stop. Not the overnight storm from before. This was something committed, a full-scale summer deluge that turned the yard to mud in under an hour and made the creek audible from the house. Not a trickle now, but a real sound, deep and moving. The sound of water that had somewhere to go and was going there fast. By mid-afternoon, it was clear they weren't going anywhere. Rowan had been working the site of the burned barn that morning, clearing the charred timber and stacking the salvageable pieces. He'd come in with his boots carrying half the yard and his hair dripping before the worst of it hit. He'd changed his shirt and gone quiet the way he did when he was thinking through a problem. She'd been at the table with the account book. She did that most evenings, went through the numbers, tracked what was spent and what was owed and what remained. It was the part of running the homestead that nobody saw, and most people didn't think about. The fence posts didn't pay for themselves. The sulfur powder and the lamp oil and the salt had a cost. She tracked every cent in a ledger that Eli had started and she had continued, and she understood the land's finances, the way she understood the land's weather, as something real and non-negotiable that you worked with, rather than against. Rowan sat across from her. He looked at the ledger. He didn't say anything. She looked up. "Can you read a balance sheet?" "Enough." She turned the ledger around and pushed it toward him. He studied it. He went through several pages with the same focused attention he gave to fence lines and maps. And she watched him do it. "Your winter feed costs are going to go up without the barn stores," he said. "I know. I've been working through the options." She pulled the ledger back and pointed to a column. "If I sell 2 of the cattle at the fall market, I can cover feed through March. Past March, the spring grass should be sufficient." He nodded. "And if the market price is down?" "Then I sell 3. She tapped the page. "I keep a reserve here. Eli's principle, you never sell your last option. You find what can be let go of without breaking the system, and you let it go. He looked at the reserve column. That's sound. It's not complicated. It's just honest accounting. She sat back. Most people who lose their land don't lose it to bad luck. They lose it because they stopped being honest with themselves about the numbers. He was quiet for a moment. You teach bookkeeping? I learned it from my mother. She closed the ledger. She ran a millinery in Ohio. 8 employees and a supply chain across 3 states, all of it in her head and in a ledger that she kept the same way every day for 20 years. She said the ledger is how you keep promises to yourself. Outside, the rain hammered on. Lightning flashed over the mesa, white and flat. Thunder followed it, long and rolling. Rowan got up and went to the window. He looked at the storm for a while. His reflection in the glass looked back at her. "Do you know how to use a rifle past 100 yards?" he asked. "I can hit a post at 100. Past that, I'm guessing." He turned around. Long-range marksmanship isn't about guessing. It's about accounting. He sat back down across from her. You account for the wind speed, the elevation, the distance. You know your rifle, how it pulls, how far the sight is off from true. You're doing the same kind of calculation you do with the ledger. Known variables, honest numbers. She considered that. Show me. Not today. Storm's going to be here through tonight and probably tomorrow morning. He paused. But when it breaks, she got up to check the stove. Tracking is different. Tracking is reading what's already happened. Ground tells you everything if you know how to ask it. He rested his arms on table. It's observation and pattern. Not different from what you do when you're managing a herd. You read behavior, you read sign. Can you teach it? I can teach the principles. The rest is practice. She put the kettle on. The rain ran in sheets down the kitchen window, the glass blurring the view of the yard into something abstract, just shapes and water, and the distant dark of the mesa. My mother also taught me that a partnership only works if both people bring something to it, she said from the stove. Not the same things, different things. That's the point. A pause behind her. What did she bring? The numbers and the vision. My father brought the supply relationships and the physical work. She turned around. He used to say she was the architect and he was the builder. She used to say he was the map and she was the compass. Rowan looked at the table. Which one are you? She thought about it. Both on a good day. Neither. When things are hard, she sat back down. You? He considered it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect or make it small. I've always known how to move through territory. How to read it. How to find what's there. He paused. I've been less good at knowing where to stop. Until now? He met her eyes. Until now. The kettle started to whistle. She made the tea and brought 2 cups to the table, and they sat across from each other while the storm went on outside. She got the ledger back out. She showed him the column structure she used, the way she tracked seasonal variation, the projection method she'd developed over 3 years of running this land. He asked specific questions, not the questions of a man learning for the sake of it, but the questions of a man who was planning to use what he was learning. She noticed that. She filed it away, without comment. He told her about long-range, shooting the principles of wind compensation, the way you use the natural environment as a reference rather than fighting it, the difference between reactive shooting and deliberate shooting. She asked specific questions, too. The men Croft sent, she said, when they come again. If I'm on the roof? Don't go for the center of the target, he said. Go for the side. You're not trying to end the encounter. You're trying to change the geometry of it. Move someone out of position. Create confusion. He paused. Shooting to disarm rather than to kill isn't weakness. It's control. The person who controls the geometry of a fight wins it. She thought about that. The person who controls the geometry of a fight wins it. Always. Whether it's a gunfight or a courtroom. He looked at her across the table. You did that at the courthouse. You put your documents down in a specific order for a reason. She almost smiled. I did. What was the reason? The genuine signatures first. So they'd been looking at them for 10 minutes before they looked at the forged one. By then, the difference was obvious to anyone with eyes. She sipped her tea. You lead with what's true, then you show what isn't. The contrast does the work. He nodded slowly. The contrast does the work, he repeated, like he was adding it to something. Outside, a branch somewhere went down in a gust. The rain redoubled. They stayed at the table until the lamp needed filling, and then filled it and stayed some more. She taught him the projection model for seasonal cash flow. He taught her how to use terrain features as wind indicators. They were both better at this than at most things sitting with a problem, turning it over, handing it back and forth. At some point, she got the cold cornbread from the rack and put it on the table between them, and they ate it without stopping the conversation. It was, she thought, the most useful evening she'd spent in longer than she could remember. When the lamp finally got low enough to mean it, she stacked the ledger and closed the notebooks, and they both went to their rooms. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain. She thought about architecture and building, about maps and compasses, about two people who were different enough to cover the distance between them. The rain kept going all night. In the morning, it slowed. The flash flood warning came from Rowan, not from any official. He was up before dawn and out in the yard reading the creek sound. She heard him come back in, heard his boots on the wall floor, and was already sitting up when he knocked on the doorframe. The creek's running hard, he said, through the door. The mesa drainage is coming down all at once. We've got 3 hours, maybe 4, before Dry Creek jumps its bank. A pause. Croft will know that too. The road south floods out when the creek goes over. If he wants to move on the homestead, tonight is his window, before it becomes unreachable for a week. She was dressed and had the rifle down from the wall in under 2 minutes. She opened the door. He was already in his coat, already armed. His face was still healing, the eye almost open now. The cut along his jaw scabbed over clean. You sent word to Mercer, she said. It wasn't a question last night. Before the creek got loud, he looked at her steadily. He sent word to the Federal Marshal's Circuit. Whether they come is not something we can count on. No. She went to the kitchen and loaded the extra ammunition into her coat pocket. She checked the rifle. She thought through the property, the angles, the approaches, the high ground. The roof of the house covers the east approach and the yard, she said. I'll work the south along the fence line. I can see the Dry Creek Road from the fence corner. She looked at him. You shoot to disarm. I shoot to disarm, he agreed. Unless, she said. The understanding was clear. There was a line, and they both knew where it was. They went out into the pre-dawn dark. The mud was thick and serious, not the surface mud of a quick storm, but the deep, comprehensive mud of sustained saturation. Every step pulled. The creek sound was steady and large and coming from where it didn't usually have much to say. She got up on the roof before full light. Using the fence post ladder Rowan had jury-rigged against the eave. She brought the rifle and the extra ammunition and a position behind the chimney stack where she had line of sight to the yard gate, the south fence and the road approach. She waited. Rowan was at the fence corner. She could see him in the growing gray light, still and low, using the post shadow, the way he'd described, not fighting the geometry, becoming part of it. Full light came in. Slowly, the clouds still thick and moving from the west. The creek was loud enough now to hear from the roof clearly. She could see the south end of the property was already sheeting water. She heard the horses before she saw them. 6 riders, coming down the road at a pace that said they knew they were working against time. 2 of them had torches, held low and guttering in the wet air, which told her everything about what they'd come to do. Burn the house before the road flooded out. Same move as the barn, scaled up. She sighted along the rifle, steady. Accounting for the distance, for the slight left pull she'd identified in this rifle over 3 years of use, the riders hit the gate. The first one through caught Rowan's shot in his gun hand, a precise, brutal snap of a shot that sent the pistol into the mud and the man off his horse with a yell of pain. The second one wheeled and reached for his rifle, and she put a round through his rifle stock, clean right at the grip. The rifle dropped. The yard erupted into noise and confusion. 3 of the remaining 4 tried to push through the gate. The 4th, the one with a torch, turned his horse and made for the south fence, trying to come around. She tracked him from the roof. He was angling toward the blind side, toward where Rowan was working, and he wasn't in Rowan's line of sight yet. She took the shot. It hit the torch rather than the man, the butt of it, below his hand, and the torch went sideways into the mud and went out. The horse shied hard, and the rider fought to stay on, and in that chaos of movement, he was no longer heading anywhere useful. Rowan had 2 of the gate men down arms, shoulders, nothing fatal, but effectively out of the fight, and was moving the 3rd one back with well-placed shots that made the horse decide the gate was a bad idea. The leader, she recognized him now. The man on the gray stallion from the first day, Croft's principal man, had pulled up short of the gate. He was reading the situation. He was a professional, and professionals count shots and estimate positions, and he was doing that now, his horse turning circles in the mud. He looked up at the roof. She looked back at him through the sight. He made the calculation. She could see it happen. He pulled his horse around. That was when she and Rowan opened the spillway gate. It wasn't a complicated mechanism, a reinforced timber gate. Rowan had rebuilt, and Willa had engineered 3 weeks ago when she'd first started thinking about the creek as an asset rather than just a boundary. The gate controlled the overflow channel from the well system to the low ground at the south fence. In normal conditions, it was closed. In a flash flood condition, with the creek already running high and the ground completely saturated, opening it created a fast, muddy channel across the south road. The channel reached Croft's retreating riders in under a minute. Not dangerous, not deep enough to drown a horse, but thick, sucking, adobe mud flowing calf-deep at a speed that made progress impossible. 3 horses went to their knees in it. 2 riders dismounted and were immediately stuck to their shins. Croft's principal man made it 30 feet and stopped. They were not going anywhere. And then, from the north road, the canyon approach, Rowan's road, she heard hoofbeats, more than 2 horses. She kept the rifle up and tracked the sound, and then she saw the badge, Federal Marshal's badge, catching the gray morning light. 4 of them, riding down from the north with the efficiency of men who'd been briefed and knew what they were riding into. Mercer had come through. The remaining fight left the situation in about 30 seconds. Federal marshals have a particular authority that local corruption can't touch. They report to a different structure entirely, outside Croft's reach, above Garrett's jurisdiction. The riders in the mud stopped struggling. The ones in the yard put their hands up. Croft's principal man looked at the marshals, and then at the mud around his horse's legs, and then at whatever had happened to his options. He put his hands up, too. She climbed down from the roof. Her legs were shaking slightly. She noticed it clinically as information about what her body had just been through, and she walked across the muddy yard to where Rowan was standing at the fence corner. He was looking at the marshal leading the riders in. He was holding his side with one hand and his rifle with the other. "You called it right," she said. 4 hours, 3.5. He looked at the mud channel running across the south road. "Your spillway held. I engineered it right." "You did." One of the marshals, a broad man with a gray beard and a blue federal coat, rode up to the gate. He looked at the scene, he looked at Willa, he looked at Rowan. "Dr. Mercer filed the notification," he said. "We have a federal warrant for Thayer Croft on charges of wire fraud, land fraud, and conspiracy to interfere with federal homestead claims." He paused. "Is Croft here?" "Croft isn't here," she said. "But these are his men, and that's his operation." She reached into her coat and pulled out the copy of the forged mortgage document, which she had kept on her person every day since the courthouse. "And this is his forgery." The marshal took it. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You rode to the courthouse." "I did. 3 days ago." "We know." The council filing triggered the federal notification. He folded the document. We'll need statements. You'll have them. She turned back to the yard. The mud battle at Dry Creek was over. Croft's men were in the hands of federal authority, which meant outside the reach of Sheriff Garrett's particular interpretation of the law. Rowan walked up beside her. They stood and looked at the yard together. The mud, the spent shells, the open gate still running its muddy channel. The horses standing around in the wet morning, looking put upon. The barn site needs clearing, he said. Tomorrow, she said. Today I need to give a federal statement, and then I need to sleep for about 12 hours. That's a sound plan. She looked at him. He looked back. His face was bruised and tired, and he had mud to his knees, and he'd been shooting around a cracked rib all morning. She thought about what they'd just done. Together, each covering the angle the other couldn't see. Each doing what the other couldn't do alone. Sound plan, she agreed. They went inside. Thayer Croft was arrested at his ranch house 8 miles east of town on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the mud battle at Dry Creek. The federal marshal brought 6 men for it, which turned out to be unnecessary. Croft opened the door in his good coat and his neat beard, and looked at the warrant and looked at the 6 men, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped out onto his own porch and offered his wrists. Whatever else he was not a man who made theatrical gestures when the arithmetic was clearly against him. Sheriff Garrett resigned his office by letter that same day. He left the territory within a week. Nobody went after him. The marshal said the federal case didn't need him, and Willa, when asked, said the same. She didn't need Garrett destroyed. She needed the structure he'd been propping up to collapse, and it had. Harriet Cole from the millinery took the sheriff position on an interim basis, which made 3 people in town very uncomfortable, and everyone else broadly relieved. Dr. Josiah Mercer came back to the homestead the week after the arrest. He came in the afternoon this time, not the middle of the night, and he came with his medical bag and 2 crates in the back of a wagon. Willa met him at the gate, and they shook hands. I heard about the spillway, he said. It worked. I heard you shot a torch out of a man's hand from a rooftop. I was aiming for his wrist. She paused. The torch was close enough. He laughed. It was a good laugh, full, and without reservation, the laugh of a man who'd had enough hard days to appreciate a genuinely funny moment. She helped him with the crates. Inside were medical supplies, reference books, a folded set of surgical instruments wrapped in clean cloth. She helped him carry them to the east corner of the property, the flat 1/4 acre she'd set aside, the one with good drainage and morning light and room to build. She'd told him about the land a month ago, in a letter. She'd offered it in writing, formally, because some things should be documented. The deed transfer is filed, she said. The land is yours. Clear title. He stood on his land and looked at the corner posts she and Rowan had already set. You didn't have to do this. I know that. She stood beside him and looked at what the clinic would be. This territory needs a doctor who stays. You're the best doctor I've ever seen work, and I've got land I'm not using and a creek that's running again. She looked at him. It made sense. He was quiet for a moment. A lot of people in this territory won't come to a black doctor. A lot of people in this territory will, she said. And the ones who need help badly enough will come regardless. That's always been true. You know that better than I do. He did know it. He'd been riding into the dark for a year, proving it. I'll need to build, he said. Rowan's good with timber framing. He's been looking for a project since we finished the barn. Mercer looked at the corner posts again. He put his hand on the nearest one. It was solid, set deep in plumb. Then I accept, he said. They shook hands again. She felt the formality of it, and appreciated it not because it was necessary between friends, but because it marked the moment. Some moments should be marked. Rowan had the new barn framed and half-sided by the time the Mercer Clinic started going up on the east corner. The 2 projects ran simultaneously through August 1 on each end of the property, both of them built out of salvaged timber and new-cut lumber, and the particular energy of people who are building something that will last. Mercer turned out to be a competent carpenter, which surprised no one who'd watched him work with his hands. He and Rowan developed a shorthand, in the way that two people do when they're working on the same problem with compatible skills. Not many words, a lot of mutual adjustment, the kind of efficiency that looks like choreography from the outside. Willa ran the both of them with the ledger and the supply lists and the schedule that kept the projects on track. She also helped with the framing when there were 3 people's worth of work and 2 people doing it, which was most days. The territory noticed. People came out from town to see what was going up on the Lawson homestead. Some of them came with offers to help. A few of them came because they were curious about the Black Doctor with a clinic. Some of those came back a second time because curiosity cured itself, and they found a man who listened carefully and charged fairly and knew what he was doing. Dry Creek had water in it through September, which hadn't happened in 4 years. The late summer grass came back in patches. Not much, not enough to undo 3 months of drought in a few weeks, but enough to see the direction things were going. Enough to feed the cattle through fall without the emergency sale she'd planned. She noted it in the ledger with careful satisfaction. On a Saturday in early September, Willa and Rowan rode into town together. Not to the courthouse this time, to the land records office. They sat down at the clerk's desk and spread out the document they'd been working on together for 2 weeks. Not a marriage license, not a deed transfer. A joint ownership deed, both their names, equal percentages, co-equal rights to every decision regarding the property. Signed at the same time, witnessed by the same hand. The clerk looked at it. He was a young man, new to the office, and he read the document twice. This isn't the standard form. No, Willa said. We drafted it ourselves, based on the Territorial Partnership Property Statute of 1871. That statute allows joint ownership between any 2 adults in equal or specified proportion. She pointed to the relevant clause. We've specified equal. He read it a 3rd time. It's legal, he said, sounding slightly surprised. It is, she agreed. He stamped it and filed it and gave them the copy. She folded the copy and put it in the satchel with the brass clasp. Rowan held the door for her on the way out. She walked through and then turned and looked at him, and he looked at her. Half, she said. Half, he said. There was no ceremony. There were no witnesses except the clerk, who was already on to the next document. No one gave anyone away to anyone else. 2 people had looked at a piece of land and a piece of paper and said, equally, and at the same time, yes. That was what it was. They rode home in the late afternoon. The sun hit the red peaks of the mesa in the last hour before it dropped. That particular gold that only happens when the light comes in at a long angle and the rock has baked all day and gives it back warm. The road was dry, and the creek was audible from the far side of the fence, and the new barn roof caught the light on its fresh-cut lumber. She got down from the horse and went to the porch. She brought out 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, not the twice-used grounds she'd been stretching all summer, but the good beans she'd been saving since July, and she stood on the porch steps and held a cup and watched the light change on the mesa. Rowan came up from the barn. He walked across the yard in that deliberate, unhurried way he had. He reached the porch and he rested his arm over her shoulders, easy and natural, and stood beside her. She handed him the 2nd cup. He took it. He looked out at the mesa. The light was going amber now. The creek was talking in the middle distance. From the east corner of the property, she could see the framed walls of Mercer's clinic standing clean against the sky, waiting for a roof. Out here, on this land, 2 people had come from broken places and built something that stood. Not because anyone had saved anyone, because they'd both shown up day after day and done the work and told the truth and held on when the fire came. That was all it had ever been, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The sun went behind the mesa. The gold faded to rose and then to the deep, quiet purple of a summer evening in the territory. and the first stars came out hard and bright above the red rock. Willa Lawson sipped her coffee. Rowan Hayes stood beside her. Neither of them needed saving. Both of them stayed. That's the end of the story. But before you go, I want to sit with you here for just a moment because this one meant something to me, and I think it might mean something to you, too. Willa Lawson never asked to be a symbol. She was just a woman trying to keep the land her husband built and the life she'd chosen. But somewhere between stringing 40 feet of barbed wire alone, in 100-degree heat, and walking into that courthouse with a leather satchel and a legal argument nobody expected her to have, she became something more than that. She became proof that dignity is not something other people give you. It's something you maintain. Every single day, through the work you do and the ground you refuse to give up. And Rowan Hayes, a man carrying more weight than most people could stand under the violence he'd participated in, the things he couldn't undo, the fire that could pull him back to places he never wanted to return to. He didn't come to her homestead to be redeemed. He came because his horse gave out and he had nowhere else to fall. But here's what I keep thinking about. The moment that changed everything wasn't when he fixed the fence, or climbed the windmill, or retrieved her supplies through 6 miles of rough canyon country. The moment that changed everything was when he stopped pretending he was fine, when he rested his forehead against her and whispered, with everything he had left, "Then take care of me." That kind of honesty takes more courage than any gunfight. Asking for help, truly asking, without armor, without pretense, that is one of the hardest things a person can do. And it is also where healing begins. Dr. Josiah Mercer deserves his own moment here. He rode through the dark for a year, into uncertain situations, into towns that didn't want him, treating people who might or might not let him through the door, and he kept going. Because the work was necessary, and he was the one who could do it. History has a way of forgetting men like Josiah Mercer. This story doesn't, and neither should we. The Buffalo Soldiers were real. The prejudice they faced was real. The dignity they carried, despite it, was real. When Willa set that porcelain cup on her best table and pulled out the chair across from hers, she wasn't making a political statement. She was just being a decent human being. That's all it ever takes. And somehow, even now, it still matters enough to say out loud. What this story is really about, underneath the drought and the burning barn and the forged documents and the mud and the gunfire, is the question of what we build and who we build it with. Willa and Rowan didn't fall in love because they rescued each other. They fell in love because they respected each other, because they sat across the same table and said, "Here is what I know. Here is what I don't know. Here is what I can do. Here is where I need you." That joint ownership deed wasn't just a legal document. It was the most honest declaration of partnership I've ever written. No one given away. No one diminished. Two people, equal, choosing the same piece of ground at the same moment. That's not just romance. That's a blueprint for how human beings should treat each other. The frontier was brutal and unfair and full of people who used power to take what wasn't theirs. Some things haven't changed as much as we'd like. But the other thing the frontier taught, the thing Willa understood better than anyone, is that the land rewards people who do the work honestly, who keep their accounts straight, who build things meant to last. You lead with what's true, then you show what isn't. The contrast does the work. She said that in a courtroom. It works everywhere. If this story gave you something, a moment of escape, a character you recognized, a feeling you needed to feel, then it did exactly what I hoped it would. Stories set in the Old West are not just about the past. They're about the parts of us that are permanent, the need to belong somewhere, the need to be seen as we are, the need to stand on our own ground and say, "This is mine, I built it, and I am not leaving." Thank you for spending this time with Willa, Anne, Rowan, and Josiah. Thank you for being here. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a good story today. Leave a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one. And if you're new here, welcome. There are more stories where this one came from, and I'm not slowing down anytime soon. Until next time, take care of each other out there.